A king was crowned in a golden palace, in a walled city, in a country most Western history books barely mention. His name was Thibaw. His capital was Mandalay. His dynasty had ruled for generations, with its own army, its own laws, its own foreign ambassadors, its own throne room lined in gold. This was not some forgotten backwater. This was Burma, a real nation, with a real king and a real court that answered to no one else on earth. And yet, within a matter of days, all of it would be gone. Most people who've heard of Burma's royal family know almost nothing about them. They don't know a king was put on a bullock cart and shipped away from his own capital. They don't know he would die decades later, in a country not his own, having never once seen home again. They don't know his 4 daughters would scatter in 4 completely different directions, into poverty, into rebellion, into obscurity, and eventually, generations later, into a strange kind of fame. This is that story. To understand what Burma's royal family lost, you have to understand what they had. The Konbaung dynasty had ruled Burma since the 1750s. By the time young Prince Thibaw took the throne in 1878, that dynasty was still very much alive. Thibaw was crowned king at just 19 years old. He wasn't some figurehead installed by foreign powers. He was a genuine Burmese sovereign, ruling from a genuine Burmese capital with a genuine Burmese court around him. Mandalay in the 1870s and 1880s was a real seat of power. The royal palace complex held throne rooms, audience halls, private apartments, and a walled city around it. Thibaw governed with ministers, with a treasury, with an army, with the full machinery of an actual state. His wife, Queen Supayalat, was every bit as central to the court as he was, known for her sharp political instincts and her firm grip on palace affairs. Picture it for a second. A royal court, a functioning government, a young king, barely out of his teens, sitting on a throne his ancestors had held for over 100 years. That was Burma in 1878, but Burma sat in a dangerous spot on the map. The British had already taken pieces of the country in earlier wars, decades before Thibaw was even born. Lower Burma, the coastal regions, belonged to the British Empire already. Only Upper Burma, the northern heartland around Mandalay, remained independent. And that independence was becoming less convenient for British interests with every passing year. Thibaw knew this. He tried to hedge his bets, the way rulers under pressure often do. In 1883, his government sent a delegation to Paris, hoping to build ties with France, hoping a foreign counterweight might keep the British at arm's length. 2 years later, a French representative arrived in Mandalay, a commercial treaty in hand. That single decision, a young king reaching out to France for protection, would become one small thread in a much larger unraveling. British officials in Rangoon, in Calcutta, in London, started talking louder about annexation, about simply absorbing what remained of independent Burma into the empire. Thibaw didn't see the full shape of what was coming. Almost no one in Mandalay did. The palace kept functioning, the court kept its rituals, the king kept ruling, the way kings had ruled there for over a century. He had no idea that within 2 years, his entire kingdom would collapse in less time than it takes to plan a wedding. He had no idea a business dispute over teakwood, of all things, would be the spark, and he had absolutely no idea that the next time he left his palace, he would never return to it again. He would never return to it again, and the reason had almost nothing to do with armies or ideology. It came down to timber. There was a British company operating in Upper Burma called the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation. It made its money extracting teak, a dense and valuable hardwood, from the forests around the Ningyan region. Thibaw's government accused the company of cheating on its payments to the crown. It wasn't a wild accusation. Companies shortchanged local governments all the time in this era, and Thibaw's ministers believed they had a legitimate case. In 1885, Thibaw's government demanded a fine. The number was enormous, £100,000, a staggering sum for the time, aimed at a British corporation operating on Burmese soil. That single financial demand became the excuse the British had been waiting for. The Indian viceroy at the time, Lord Dufferin, didn't respond with negotiation. He responded with an ultimatum. In October 1885, Dufferin sent word to Mandalay demanding Thibaw back down, reconsider the fine, and effectively submit to British oversight of the dispute. It was the kind of ultimatum designed less to be accepted than to be refused. Thibaw refused it. Maybe he believed his kingdom could withstand British pressure the way it had for decades. Maybe he underestimated how badly London wanted an excuse. Whatever the reasoning, the young king held his ground, and the ultimatum expired unanswered. Imagine being 19 years old, sitting on a throne you inherited, receiving a letter from a foreign empire telling you how to run your own country, and being expected just to comply. Thibaw didn't comply. Almost no independent monarch in his position would have. But refusal came at a price the Burmese court could not have fully calculated. Behind the teak fine sat a much larger and much older ambition, one British officials in Rangoon and London had been nursing for years: full control of Upper Burma, and with it, full control of the last unclaimed piece of the country. The teak dispute wasn't really about teak. It was a pretext, a convenient grievance dressed up as a legal one. The British had annexed Lower Burma decades earlier. Upper Burma, with its ancient capital and its ruling dynasty, was the one remaining obstacle to controlling the whole country. A fine of £100,000 against a British trading company gave London exactly the trigger it needed. By late October 1885, the ultimatum had lapsed. Diplomatic language stopped. Military planning started. None of this was visible from inside the palace walls of Mandalay. The court continued its rituals. Ministers continued their meetings. Somewhere in Calcutta and London, though, orders were already being drafted, troops were already being positioned, and a very different kind of message was already on its way toward Upper Burma. This one wouldn't arrive as a letter, it would arrive as an army. It arrived faster than anyone in Mandalay could have prepared for. On November 14, 1885, British forces crossed into Upper Burmese territory. Gunboats moved up the Irrawaddy River. Infantry columns advanced by land. The invasion had one clear objective: Mandalay, the royal capital, the seat of a dynasty that had ruled for over a century. Burmese defenses fell almost immediately. This wasn't a drawn-out siege. It was a rapid collapse. Within roughly 2 weeks, British troops reached the outskirts of the capital itself. 14 days. That's how long it took to end a kingdom that had stood for generations. On November 29, 1885, Thibaw surrendered. The palace that had housed the Konbaung dynasty for decades, the throne room where he'd been crowned only 7 years earlier, the private apartments where his 4 young daughters had grown up, all of it now belonged, in practical terms, to a foreign power. Before Thibaw left Mandalay, he handed over one of his most treasured possessions to a British colonel, a famous ruby known as the Na Mauk, said to be worth a kingdom in its own right, tied specifically to the personal wealth and status of Burmese kings. He gave it up along with his crown, his court, and his capital, in the space of a single afternoon. Then came the moment that ended his reign for good. Thibaw was put onto a bullock cart, an ordinary wooden cart pulled by oxen, the kind used for transporting goods, not sovereigns. He was taken away from the only home he had ever known. Accounts from those final hours describe a palace and city in disarray, servants and townspeople scrambling amid the sudden collapse of royal authority. The finer details of that chaos are less firmly documented than the broad fact of it. A kingdom had ended almost overnight. Almost no one inside it had time to process what was happening. Thibaw seems to have believed, at least at first, that this was temporary. He appears to have thought he was being taken away for negotiations, for some kind of settlement about his future role, maybe even a British-supervised protectorate with himself still nominally in charge. He was wrong. There would be no protectorate. There would be no return. On January 1, 1886, just over a month after his surrender, the British formally announced the annexation of Upper Burma. The entire country, coastal regions and capital alike, now belonged to the British Empire. A resistance did follow. Burmese fighters, former soldiers, local tribesmen, all launched a guerrilla insurgency against British rule that dragged on for close to a decade. But that resistance never came close to restoring Thibaw to his throne. The monarchy itself was finished the moment he stepped onto that cart. 19 years old at his coronation, 26 years old when it all ended. 7 years on the throne, and then nothing left of the kingdom he'd inherited, gone in the space of 2 weeks and one signature. The story of Burma's royal family after this point isn't really a story about a kingdom anymore. It's a story about a family, stripped of everything that made them royal except the memory of it, trying to figure out what comes next, in a place they never chose, that they were never meant to leave. They never chose it, and that was exactly the point. British officials debated where to send the deposed king. This wasn't a minor administrative detail. It was a deliberate strategic decision, and there was precedent for it. The last king of Sri Lanka had been exiled to Vellore. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, had been sent to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. Deposed monarchs, in the British imperial playbook, weren't executed. They were removed, quietly, permanently, to somewhere far enough away that they couldn't inspire anyone back home. For Thibaw, That place was Ratnagiri. Ratnagiri was a small port town on India's Konkan coast, isolated, without a railway connection, chosen specifically because it was hard to reach and easy to control. No easy travel in, no easy travel out, no steady flow of visitors who might carry messages back to Burma or rally support for restoration. It was exile designed, quite literally, to be forgotten. In April 1886, King Thibaw, Queen Supayalat, and their 4 young daughters arrived in Ratnagiri. The eldest was not yet 6 years old. The British had a 30-room mansion built for the family, spacious by ordinary standards, comfortable in a purely material sense, but comfort wasn't freedom. The mansion sat under close supervision. Every movement was watched, every visitor was noted. The family lived well by the standards of a prison, and it was, in every meaningful sense, still a prison. Think about what that meant for 4 little girls. One day they were princesses in a golden palace in Mandalay, surrounded by servants, courtiers, and the rituals of a court centuries old. The next, they were children in an unfamiliar coastal town in a foreign country, watched constantly, with no clear sense of when or if they would ever go home. Thibaw himself had few options left. He wasn't permitted to return to Burma. He wasn't permitted meaningful political activity. What remained to him was a kind of frozen existence, royal in name, powerless in practice, thousands of miles from the throne room where he'd been crowned. The mansion in Ratnagiri became known, informally, as Thibaw's Palace, a title that carried a quiet cruelty in it. It looked like a palace. It functioned like a cage. Meanwhile, back in Burma, the country the family had left behind was being rapidly reshaped without them. British administrators dismantled the old royal governing structures. The insurgency dragged on in the countryside. And in Mandalay, the palace that had once belonged to the Konbang dynasty was gradually converted into something else entirely, eventually serving British administrative purposes, its throne room reduced to office space. None of the family knew, in 1886, how long this arrangement would last. They had no way of knowing it would stretch on for over 3 decades. They had no way of knowing that the man who once ruled an entire kingdom would eventually die in that mansion, in a country not his own, having never once been allowed to go home. He would never be allowed to go home, and the years in Ratnagiri stretched on with a kind of slow, grinding permanence. Life in exile settled into routine. The family had money, servants, a large house. What they didn't have was freedom, or purpose, or any real path back to Burma. Thibaw, once a king with an army and a treasury at his command, spent his days as a closely watched private citizen in a foreign colony. His daughters grew up almost entirely in India, shaped far more by Ratnagiri than by Mandalay. They had been born into a monarchy. They were raised in a mansion under guard. That contradiction never really resolved itself. The years wore on Thibaw. Multiple accounts from the period describe his health and spirit gradually deteriorating under the weight of exile, though the exact medical causes of his decline aren't precisely documented in the historical record. In December 1916, King Thibaw died in Ratnagiri. Sources differ slightly on the exact date, with some placing it around December 16th and others around December 19th, but the month, the year, and the location are firmly established. He was buried in a modest grave near the Christian cemetery in the town, an ordinary resting place for a man who had once been crowned king of an entire country. 30 years, that's roughly how long his exile had lasted by the time he died. 30 years since the bullock cart. 30 years since the ruby changed hands. 30 years, and he never once set foot in Burma again. There's something worth sitting with in that. A king, deposed at 26, spends the rest of his life, 3 full decades, in a house he didn't choose, in a country that wasn't his, waiting for a return that never came. His death didn't happen in front of adoring crowds or amid the rituals of a royal court. It happened quietly, in a modest colonial town most of his former subjects had never heard of, thousands of miles from the Golden Palace where his reign began. For Queen Supayalat and the 4 daughters, Thibaw's death marked the end of one long chapter of confinement. It also marked the start of something far more uncertain. The family that had been kept together, under one roof, under one set of restrictions, for 30 years, was about to come apart. Some of them would eventually return to Burma, some would build entirely new lives in India, and one, it would soon become clear, had already begun charting a path none of the others would follow. None of the daughters would follow the same path. The differences between them would only widen in the years after their father's death. After Thibaw died in 1916, the British eventually allowed Queen Supayalat and her 2 youngest daughters to return to Burma. In 1919, they arrived back in the country they had left as children, or, in the Queen's case, as a woman who had spent 33 years waiting for exactly this moment. But they weren't allowed to settle in Mandalay. British authorities worried the old royal capital was too politically sensitive, too likely to stir up nationalist sentiment if the family reappeared there. Instead, they were placed in Rangoon, the commercial city the British themselves had built up as their colonial center. It should have been a homecoming. In some ways it was. In other ways, it was just a different kind of exile, in a different Burmese city, under a different set of restrictions. By the time that return happened, the family's story had already split into 4 very different directions. The eldest daughter, Myat Phaya, had lived a life defined by scandal and hardship long before her father's death. In 1906, at 26 years old, she began a relationship with an Indian palace gatekeeper named Gopal, a married man of much lower social status. She had a child with him. In the rigid social world of a deposed royal family clinging to whatever dignity it had left, this was treated as a devastating disgrace. Her father was reportedly furious. She was, in effect, cast out of her own family's inner circle. When the rest of the family was eventually allowed to return to Burma, she went back too, briefly. She was not welcomed. She soon returned to her husband and her life in Ratnagiri, distant from her royal relatives, distant from any real support. She lived out the rest of her life there, in continued hardship, and died in 1947, at 66 years old, still in Ratnagiri, the same town her father had died in 3 decades earlier. Her sister's path could not have looked more different. The second daughter, Supayalat, fell in love with her father's own private secretary, a man named King Thibaw Min, while the family was still living together in exile. In October 1916, shortly before her father's death, she eloped with him, defying her parents' wishes the same way her elder sister once had. This time, the outcome would be very different. The couple married formally in February 1917 and settled in Kalimpong, a town in the Indian Himalayas, where they built a quiet, stable life raising dairy cattle. They had no biological children, but adopted a son. Myat Phaya would go on to be recognized as the head of the entire royal house after her father's death, a title she held until her own death in 1956. 2 sisters, 2 elopements against their parents' wishes, 2 opposite outcomes. Then there was the 4th daughter, Myat Phaya, whose path took a far more defiant turn. In the early 1930s, decades after the fall of the kingdom, she made a dramatic, public bid to reclaim her father's throne, refusing to let the memory of the monarchy fade into colonial history. British authorities responded firmly. They relocated her and her family to Mandalay, in Lower Burma, deliberately distancing her from Mandalay's political energy, hoping isolation would quiet her down. It didn't fully succeed, and it also didn't end well. Myat Phaya died in Mandalay in March 1936, at 48 years old. Some sources describe her death as having raised suspicions at the time, though the exact circumstances were never conclusively established, and the truth of what happened to her remains, to this day, genuinely unresolved. Poverty and ostracism, a quiet, stable escape, public defiance followed by an early, unexplained death. 3 sisters, 3 sharply different endings, born from the same collapse, the same exile, the same 30 years inside that guarded mansion in Ratnagiri. If the story stopped here, it would be almost nothing but loss. A king who died far from home, a daughter who died in poverty, another who died under a cloud of suspicion after daring to challenge the empire that had swallowed her family's kingdom. But it doesn't stop here, because not every branch of this family's story ended the way it began. Myat Phayalat's life in Kalimpong stands as the clearest proof of that. While her sisters navigated scandal, poverty, and political defiance, she built something quieter and, in its own way, far more durable. Her marriage lasted decades. Her farm gave her purpose. Her recognized status as head of the royal house carried real symbolic weight among people who still remembered the old kingdom, even under foreign rule, even decades after annexation. Not every daughter found peace, though, and it's worth being honest about that instead of smoothing it over. Myat Phaya's life never turned a corner. She died the way she had lived for decades, in hardship, in relative isolation, far from the recognition the rest of her family eventually found. Her story doesn't have a redemptive ending, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But Myat Phayalat did, in its own understated way. She lived until 1956, 40 years past her father's death, holding a title that meant something to Burmese people who still remembered the old dynasty. She never sat on a throne, she never ruled a kingdom, but she held the family's name and its memory together in a way none of her sisters were able to. That single fact matters more than it might first appear. A family that loses a kingdom doesn't necessarily lose its identity. Supayalat's stability, her recognized headship, her 4 decades of quiet continuity, proved that something of the Konbaung name could survive the fall of the Konbaung throne. Her nephews and nieces, the children of her sister Supayalat, carried that survival into the next generation. One of them, a son named Ta Phaya, would later become head of the royal house himself, following Supayalat's death in 1956. The family line, fractured and scattered across 2 countries, somehow kept producing people willing to carry its name forward. None of this erased what had been lost. A kingdom doesn't come back because one daughter found happiness in the Himalayas, but it does complicate the picture. This wasn't purely a story of decline from a golden age to total ruin. It was a story of 4 very different responses to the same catastrophe, 3 of them ending in hardship or uncertainty, one of them proving that stability, and even a kind of quiet dignity, was still possible on the other side of losing everything. The next generation would push that possibility even further, in a direction none of Thibaw's contemporaries could have imagined, in a country that was, by then, no longer even a British colony, and the family's story had drifted a long way from throne rooms and guarded mansions. Hatek Supayalat, born in 1927 in Rangoon, was the youngest daughter of Supayalat, the same defiant princess who had been exiled to Moulmein for challenging British rule, and who had died there under still unresolved circumstances when Hatek Supayalat was just 9 years old. She grew up without the palace her grandfather once ruled from, without the guarded mansion her grandmother had lived in, without the political battles her own mother had fought. What she built instead was something entirely her own. Hatek Supayalat became a pioneering figure in Burmese sports. She competed as an athlete, she trained as a bodybuilder, at a time when that pursuit was almost unheard of for women in her country. She took part in beauty pageants too, becoming a recognizable public figure in a newly independent Burma, still figuring out its own identity after decades of colonial rule. Picture that contrast for a second. Her great-grandfather had been crowned in a golden throne room, in front of a royal court, with generations of tradition behind him. She built her public identity in gymnasiums, on athletic fields, in front of crowds who likely had little idea her family had once ruled the entire country. There's no evidence she used her royal lineage as a platform or leaned on the Konbaung name to build her career. Her achievements stood on their own. This wasn't a princess trading on faded royal glamour. This was a woman building a genuinely new kind of public life, in a genuinely new Burma, using none of the tools her ancestors once had. She married in 1962, and she lived until 2003, dying at 75 years old in Rangoon, the same city her grandmother and great-aunts had once returned to as exiles decades earlier. Consider the arc across 4 generations. A king, crowned in a palace, deposed within 7 years. A daughter, exiled to poverty and obscurity. Another daughter, achieving quiet stability far from any throne. A third, dying in a cloud of political defiance and unanswered questions. And then, a great-granddaughter, decades later, becoming a public figure entirely on her own terms, in an athletic arena that had nothing to do with royal bloodlines at all. That's not a straight line from tragedy to triumph. It's something messier and more honest. 4 generations of the same family finding 4 completely different ways to exist after losing the one thing that used to define all of them. And somewhere, back in a small Indian coastal town most of the family had left behind decades earlier, a modest grave still sat, largely forgotten, waiting for a kind of recognition that wouldn't arrive for almost a century. Almost a century passed before that recognition finally came. For decades after Thibaw's death, the military governments that eventually took power in Burma, later renamed Myanmar, showed little interest in publicly acknowledging their country's last king. A monarchy overthrown by colonial force didn't fit neatly into the narratives those governments wanted to tell about the nation's past. Thibaw's grave in Ratnagiri sat quietly, tended locally, but largely absent from official Burmese memory. That changed in 2012. Following the restoration of civilian, democratic rule in Myanmar, President Thein Sein traveled to Ratnagiri and visited King Thibaw's grave in person, paying his respects at the resting place of a monarch who had died there 96 years earlier. It was, in a real sense, the first formal acknowledgement from the Burmese state that Thibaw's story mattered, that a king who had lost his kingdom in 14 days and spent 30 years in exile deserved to be remembered as part of the nation's history, rather than quietly written out of it. Think about the timeline. Thibaw died in 1916. His country didn't send an official to visit his grave until 2012. That's 96 years of silence, longer than most human lifetimes, before a head of state finally made the trip. The family's descendants, scattered across Myanmar and India by then, carried the Konbong name forward in smaller, quieter ways. Some remained recognized within Myanmar as symbolic heirs to the old royal house, a title with no political power attached to it anymore, but real cultural meaning for people who still remembered, or had been taught about, the old kingdom. The precise details of who holds that recognition today, and how formally it's acknowledged, remain murky, and aren't something that can be stated with full confidence from outside sources. What can be said with confidence is this: the family that began this story as the rulers of an entire nation ended it as private citizens. Some prosperous, some impoverished, some publicly celebrated, scattered across two countries, connected mainly by a surname and a shared, complicated history. Somewhere in all of that sits the ruby, the Namaok, handed from Thibaw's own hands into a British colonel's on the day he left Mandalay for the last time, has never returned to Burma. It passed into private hands, its exact fate uncertain, much like so much else the family lost in that single afternoon in November 1885. A king surrendered his crown, his capital, and his most treasured possession within hours of each other. Only one of those losses, the ruby, was ever a physical object that could theoretically be found, returned, or accounted for. It never was. What does a family carry forward once a throne, a nation, and even a single symbolic gemstone have all been taken away in the same afternoon? Burma's royal family answered that question 4 different ways: through poverty, through quiet stability, through defiance, through reinvention 2 generations later in a completely different arena. The sovereignty question was never formally resolved. The ruby was never returned. The exact fate of Myat Phaya Galay remains, honestly, unknown. This isn't a story with a clean, closed ending. It's a story that's still, in its quieter corners, being pieced together. If this kind of history, the kind that gets left out of most textbooks, is something you want more of, that comment box is the best place to let me know. Hit that like button too. It genuinely helps get these stories in front of more people. And if you're new here, consider subscribing, because there are a lot more forgotten royals and vanished kingdoms still waiting to be dug up. Until next time, take care of yourself.